Hilda que eu imagino é essa Hilda que sentava bebendo seu vinho, fumando cigarro, falando palavrão com o jornalista, mas ao mesmo tempo que no fim do dia estaria sentada bem na varanda da casa dela, olhando para cima, esperando, sei lá, vir alguma entidade, alguma coisa que comprovasse para ela que a sensação dela de que teria algo a mais do que essa vida cotidiana, ela estava certa em procurar.
É uma escritora que está sempre em busca de uma literatura que tenta alcançar o sagrado na literatura. Por mais que a literatura da Hilda muitas vezes flertou com o profano, mas entre profano e sagrado não há um embate, há uma conciliação.
Ela diz que eu não me importo se algumas pessoas me chamarem de louca, porque se eu sou louca eu estou muito bem acompanhada. E eu acho que a poesia, a vida, a literatura tem a ver com isso, de você encontrar os seus. Então quando você é poeta e você lê o que a Hilda pensa a respeito da poesia, você cria uma conexão com aquilo que é muito forte.
Eu já li tantas vezes certos poemas e ainda não consegui decorar, são imagens muito difíceis, assim. Eu acho que o misterioso é isso, talvez são imagens que só ela conseguiu ver naquela época. Ela conseguiu escrever pra gente, mas eu não consigo ver de novo, né? Eu tenho que fazer um esforço muito grande para entrar nesse pensamento. E eu acho que o bonito da literatura é isso também, né? Então, qualquer hora eu posso abrir esse livro e tentar vê-lo ali, né? Mas talvez com com o mesmo ruído que ela tentava ouvir os mortos dela, assim, né? Então não consigo ver claramente a Hilda, mas eu sei que ela tá ali.
Meu negócio é com Deus, ela falava. E eu sempre li a Hilda dessa maneira. Toda a escatologia e o erotismo que envolve a literatura da Hilda, na minha opinião, está a serviço disso, dessa busca do espiritual, dessa busca do sagrado e da santidade.
A gente sente muito isso quando a gente está lendo, a gente vê muito da gente naquilo. Às vezes vai aparecer uma mulher trans ali e vai ver essa coisa da Hilda de se sentir inadequada, de falar a aflição de ser eu e não ser outra, e ela vai se sentir representada naquilo que a Hilda escreve. A gente decidiu pichar a cidade a partir do convite que está no poema da Hilda sobre o poeta ser uma pessoa que deveria repensar a tarefa de pensar o mundo. Então a gente decidiu repensar a tarefa de pensar os muros também e colocar essa mensagem na cidade para tentar interagir com as pessoas que estão passando pela cidade, por essa necessidade do poeta de se conectar com as pessoas, assim como ela queria ter uma relação com os leitores, que é uma coisa que agora ela está conseguindo, finalmente.
Salva, porra!
Boa tarde, essa é a nossa terceira mesa do dia, da quinta-feira. É uma história do livro antes do livro. A gente usa o livro no título, um pouco para vocês entenderem do que vai se tratar, mas é uma história que é muito antes do livro se tornar livro. E vocês viram a Pílula do Arte 1, um conjunto de vídeos em homenagem à Hilda, que o nosso parceiro Arte 1 sempre faz com a gente, e são os novos leitores da Hilda. Então, é uma combinação interessante da gente trazer uma história muito antiga do livro e mostrar os novos leitores da Hilda. E queria registrar que a Hilda era grande leitora, tinha uma grande biblioteca, era muito interessada em livros antigos e também acompanhava o que era contemporâneo. Para mediar essa mesa, e ela vai fazer a apresentação do nosso autor, é a Lilia Schwartz, que tem livros sobre biblioteca, que é a Longa Viagem da Biblioteca dos Reis. Ela é historiadora, antropóloga. Ano passado fez uma linda apresentação sobre o Lima Barreto. Ela vai depois da mesa, autografar essa biografia e também seu novo livro, ao lado do historiador Flávio Gomes, Dicionário da Escravidão e Liberdade. Bom, uma boa tarde, boa conversa, e eu deixo agora a palavra com a Lília. Muito obrigada.
Obrigada. Bom, boa tarde a todos. É com grande alegria que eu apresento agora o Christopher de Hamel, que é Fellow do Corpus Christi College, em Cambridge, Fellow Librarian da Parker Library. Hamel é, sem dúvida nenhuma, um dos grandes especialistas em manuscritos medievais no mundo, e o livro sobre o qual nós vamos conversar hoje, Manuscritos Notáveis, ganhou o Duff Cooper Prize em 2016 e o Wolfram History Prize em 2017, 2 prêmios importantíssimos nessa área. Hamel recebeu outro prêmio, o primeiro deles, ainda estudante em Oxford, com a sua tese sobre os comentários bíblicos do século XVII. Em 1955, Hamel começou a caçar manuscritos raros para Sotheby e ficou 25 anos caçando manuscritos. Hamel é autor de vários livros, eu vou citar apenas alguns. Scribes and Illuminators, pelo British Museum, de 1992. The Book, A History of the Bible, da Phaidon, de 2001. E hoje nós vamos falar do seu livro mais recente, chamado Manuscritos Notáveis. Esse é o seu último livro publicado, um livro publicado em vários países e também aqui no Brasil. O livro é todo descrito em primeira pessoa, como se, junto com o Hamel, nós viajássemos a diferentes lugares, entrássemos em bibliotecas inacreditáveis, em coleções maravilhosas, e junto com ele nós vamos abrindo os manuscritos notáveis, como ele diz, e seguindo a expertise que só o Christopher, vocês verão, pode ter. Por isso, o livro, quem sabe, podia ser chamado Entrevistas com Manuscritos, uma vez que cada capítulo traz uma nova biblioteca e nela um novo manuscrito que é tratado sempre como uma espécie de celebridade. Vocês vão ver agora. Eu proponho, então, que nós passemos agora a visitar alguns desses manuscritos, termo que literalmente quer dizer escrito à mão e se refere aos livros produzidos antes da entrada da máquina da imprensa no final do século XV, inventada, acho que vocês sabem, por Johannes Gutenberg. Então, vamos lá. Good afternoon and very welcome.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to start with our first question. Christopher, could you tell us a bit about your life among medieval manuscripts? How you began, and what is the place you are working now in this moment?
I've been asked to talk about my life from the beginning right through to now. I was born in London, but when I was 4, my father took a job in New Zealand. And I have 1 or 2 pictures just to illustrate what I'm saying. I don't know how I make them. Where do they come up?
Now, it will come.
Ah, yeah. Hang on.
Let's go back one. Yep.
Yeah, there we are. That was the first one. That's the book I'm meant to be talking about. My father took a job in New Zealand, and we travelled out on this ship. It was called the Rangitoto in 1959. And I should tell you that New Zealand is rather like Brazil in the sense that it's about as far from medieval Europe as you can possibly get. In fact, it's about twice as far as Brazil. And if you get interested in the Middle Ages in England, or in Europe, you can see cathedrals and castles and medieval houses. But in New Zealand or Brazil, there is nothing except the things that move. And the things that move are books. Books can be transported very easily. And when I was about 12, I stumbled on the local public library in Dunedin, at the bottom end of New Zealand, which has a small collection of medieval manuscripts, including this, which is a 15th century French book of hours. And at the age of 12, I was absolutely captivated by these. I thought they were marvellous. And it was a public library, and to give them all credit, they encouraged me, and they let me take things out of their cases and hold them and turn their pages. And I collected stamps as a schoolboy, and my oldest stamp was 19th century. and this was 15th century. I thought it was absolutely amazing. And their oldest manuscript there, and indeed the oldest one in the Southern Hemisphere, is a single framed leaf from a gospel book of the 9th century. And I asked them if I could borrow it. And they said, of course you can. And I took this home on the school bus, to the astonishment of my parents. And then one day in 1964, they acquired a new early book, and they, when I happened to be there, and they took a photograph of me looking at it. And that's me on the left, age 13, looking at a manuscript in New Zealand. Well, it became a schoolboy hobby. Then I came back to England. I went to university in Oxford, and after 3 years there working on manuscripts, I joined Sotheby's, the auction house in London. Let's move the picture on, that one, where my job was the cataloguing of medieval manuscripts, and I worked there, as Lily's told you, for 25 years. The first manuscript I described for Sotheby's was a bestiary, an encyclopedia of animals, subject in which I'm much interested, made in Germany. This actually is an elephant. The artist had never seen an elephant. And we took it to an exhibition in Munich before the sale. And while we were there, a man came in with a manuscript which he said he owned himself, which is this. And eventually this too came in for sale. This is the Spinola Book of Hours. It's the item of chapter 12 in the book I'm meant to be talking about, and it is the subject to the picture on the front cover of the Brazilian edition. This was painted, it's about this big. It was painted in the southern Netherlands, probably in Antwerp, possibly Ghent, around 1515. That's another one of its miniatures showing the Annunciation. It's a most marvelous, marvelous manuscript. And during that time, I saw a lot of manuscripts. I even came to Sao Paulo, and I brought back a little collection of manuscripts from there. And I enjoyed myself enormously. And in 2000, I joined Corpus Christi College in Cambridge with responsibility for the Parker Library, which you see here. This is one of the finest small collections of manuscripts in Britain. Lily's husband has been there, and I hope that all of you will come when you're next in Britain, but possibly not all at once. And it contains about 600 medieval manuscripts put together in the 16th century, of which the oldest is this. This is 6th century, written in the late 500s in Rome, and is the subject of chapter 1 of the book I'm meant to be talking about. And this was brought to England by St. Augustine of Canterbury at the time of the conversion of England. It is the earliest object in England of any kind that's not archaeological. It's the oldest illustrated gospel book in existence, and it's a very, very important book. And when the Pope came to England about 8 years ago, I had the unusual experience of standing in front of the high altar of Westminster Abbey on live television, holding this book, while the Pope and the Archbishop of Canterbury bowed in front of me, as you see happening here. And since then, well, I actually retired about a year ago, and I'm still obsessed with medieval manuscripts. That's how I started.
Okay. Now I go for a very simple question for you, at least. What is a manuscript? How were they made? And how we have to use this word, illuminated?
I still haven't grasped how to make these pictures work.
It's coming.
Whoops.
Yep.
There we are. The question I've been asked is, what is a manuscript? First of all, it's a Latin word, manuscriptum, written by hand. And the fact is, these are handmade books. There was no printing. Printing was invented about 1450 in Mainz in Germany, printing in Europe, that is. And before that, all books had to be made by hand. And it's not that I'm interested in them because they're made by hand. I'm interested in them because they're medieval. And what I've spent my life working on are the books of the Middle Ages, books written and produced and bound and illuminated between about the end of the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, the the 15th century. And the picture here shows a man making a manuscript. These are copied by hand. There's no easy way of doing it. It's not that they particularly enjoyed doing it. It's just simply how books were made in those days. People say it's a dead craft. No one does it now. Of course they do. There are plenty of scribes now. There are many scribes in Brazil. There may be scribes here. The picture I show you shows Donald Jackson, an English scribe working in Wales who recently has finished writing out an entire illuminated manuscript Bible. There are still people interested in the making of manuscripts. And as the man in the picture shows, he's got quill pens, and ink, and you write a book by hand. Nearly all medieval manuscripts are made on parchment or vellum, the two words are really interchangeable, which is really animal skin. In Brazil, you don't need to be told that cows are oblong creatures with legs in each corner, and if you take the skin of a calf and scrape it, as this man in this 15th century picture is doing, you end up with an oblong sheet of paper. And you fold it over, and you fold over again, and cut it open. And because it begins oblong, as you fold it, it will end up oblong. And so they made books oblong, because that was the shape of animals. And we still do. And the reason why every modern book is the shape it is because it's in its ancestry. It was made from folding up parchment. And parchment is that shape because it comes from an animal. They write them by hand, normally with a quill pen, which is a feather. You see here in a picture there's he's actually one of the evangelists, St. Matthew, writing a manuscript using a quill pen. In one hand he holds a knife and in the other a quill. The knife is for sharpening the pen, which you do about every 5 minutes if you're writing a manuscript, and for, hence the word penknife, for scratching out mistakes. If you get it wrong, you scrape them off, and for holding the parchment down. And they simply wrote the books by hand. There's no quick way of doing it. The writing is done first. The writing is done before the illumination. There are some unfinished manuscripts, like the one here, where you can see they outline the shape of where the pictures are going to be, but they actually write them first. And then it's handed over to the illuminator. And this is a self-portrait of a late medieval illuminator. He was called Simon Benning, and he worked on the manuscript, which is on the front cover of the Brazilian edition of my book. He was a Bruges illuminator, and he's shown here sitting at his desk, holding a pair of glasses because he worked with magnification. And he is the painter. What they will do is design the picture first. They draw it out very carefully. As children, we were told you shouldn't really draw before you paint, but they do. They design the whole thing very, very carefully, drawn out in ink. And the reason for doing it in ink is you can paint over it afterwards, and then it's coloured. If it contains gold, the gold is put on first. And Lily asked me to tell you briefly what the word illuminated manuscript means. Many, many medieval manuscripts contain gold. I don't need to tell you in Parati about the importance of gold in Brazilian history. But gold leaf, which you can still buy, is gold, is pure gold, which is hammered very, very thin. And this is used a great deal in medieval manuscripts. And you can buy it still from artist suppliers. And it looks something like that. That is pure gold. It's incredibly thin. It's one of those remarkable things about gold is that you can hammer it until it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. And they put in the design in the manuscript, as you can see here, it's sort of painted in glue, and then they put the gold leaf over it and press it down, and of course it will stick. The gold has almost no thickness and no weight. I mean, gold is heavy, and look at the way it floats down.
Can I have some?
You can. When women ask for gold, I always give it to them.
I think you have another one in your pocket.
We have more. So the gold goes on first, then it's burnished, and then the other colours are added in a manuscript. So they will put on the gold as they've done here, they've sketched out the pictures, and then from the top they've begun filling in the other colours, and bit by bit the colours are put in by hand, and it'll end up looking something like that. And that is roughly how a medieval manuscript is made.
Thank you. So let us go now talk about another library and another document. Let us talk about the Leiden Aratea. You have said in your book, you wrote in your book, that plagiarism is an anathema. Plagiarismo é uma anátema. However, in medieval Europe, it was an object of admiration. Can we talk about plagiarism and also about this particular manuscript kept in Leiden?
This is probably, I've just been asked probably the most intellectual question that I've ever had in an audience like this on the whole philosophical question of copying.
It's my fault. It's my fault.
It's her fault. It's her fault. She's far too far.
You can't blame me.
It's worth saying that every medieval manuscript is a copy of another manuscript, unless it's autographed, unless the author is actually writing it. Every manuscript is copied from a copy of a copy of a copy. And so everything we know about the Middle Ages, all ancient texts, including the Bible, and all classical literature, and every text of the Middle Ages, survived in one manuscript. Somebody else copies it, somebody takes a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and it goes down from one to another for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that is part of the absolute fascination of studying medieval manuscripts, watching the way that texts come down and get copied one from the other. The question I've just been asked specifically relates to one of the chapters in the book that we're meant to be talking about, which describes a early 9th century manuscript, now in the library of Leiden University. And it is a classical text. This is a picture from it. And it's one of those books on the stars, on the heavens, on astronomy. And this is ancient learning. And the scribe who's made this manuscript has imitated an ancient Roman manuscript. They probably actually had a real Roman manuscript in front of him when he was copying it. And he does these pictures showing the constellations. And I don't know whether you can see, but the stars are actually marked around the edge here of the figure and up his legs. And it explains the constellations. So this, for example, is the snake going around the two bears, Ursus Major and Ursus Minor. But what they've done is they've copied it from a classical manuscript. Now, they didn't really understand it, and I don't really understand it. It's really difficult Latin, and I don't really understand the stars. But it's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. They know it's important because it's ancient. But it raises that very interesting philosophical question that in the Middle Ages, originality was not regarded as a good thing. They always defer to earlier authors if they can. If you're inventing a book, you're writing a new story, so Boccaccio, Chaucer, writing a story, a fictional story, he'll always begin by saying, I have heard people tell this story. This is a story that comes from long ago, even when they've made it up. In other words, if you're writing, any of your students writing a PhD now, they look for originality. In the Middle Ages, they do not look for originality. They look for skill in copying, skill in reproducing, but you're reproducing something that's much, much older. And that passing on of ancient knowledge from one generation to another is a really very, very important theme running right through medieval manuscripts. Is that enough?
Yep, enough. Okay. Let me ask you about the Book of Hours that we talked about. Could you explain first, what the meaning of a Book of Hours? And also, can we talk about, you were seeing there, about As Horas de Joana de Navarro, the Book of Hours of Joana de Navarro. That's a book from the second part of the 14th century. And this book is now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, no?
In Paris, yep.
In Paris, okay.
A book of hours, and livre d'heures in French, a book of hours like the hours of your watch, is a lay person's prayer book. They are the most common surviving medieval manuscripts. Tens of thousands of them still exist. Some of you may even own a book of hours. They exist in very, very large numbers, and they were made for private people in the Middle Ages, very, very, very end of the Middle Ages, 14th to early 16th century. And the idea was that you were meant to open up your book and read a selection of psalms and prayers in honor of the Virgin Mary, usually. at each of the 8 hours of the medieval day. That is matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline, the 8 divisions of a medieval day. They were made for lay people like us. They're not for use by priests or monks. They're not for use in church. They have to be used at home. And very, very large numbers of people did have them. It was the book from which medieval children learned to read. And they're, as I say, they're extremely common. The most famous of them in the world is the Très Riche Heure of the Duke de Berry, of which I show an example here, this great manuscript illuminated for the Duke de Berry, the son of the King of France, now in the Musée Condé at Chantilly. But not all are as big or as grand as that, and some are really quite small, humble, and not expensive. Almost any of you could buy one if you wanted one. Books of ours survive in very large numbers. The second part of the question is whether I could... Oh, no, I thought I'll show you briefly this one. It's a fragment of a book of ours in the Dunedin Public Library. This is one of the first examples that I myself ever saw. And this shows the image of the flight into Egypt. This is the beginning of the prayers that you'd read at Vespers at the end of the day. And it shows the Holy Family journeying into Egypt as the sun is setting. And you can see the sun at the top coming down. It's the evening office. And the story in the background... Well, first of all, there's Joseph and Mary and the child on the donkey walking through a medieval landscape. Of course, it doesn't look like Egypt. And in the background is a little vignette of the medieval legend of the miracle of the sower. And you probably remember the story that when King Herod heard that the baby Jesus had been born, he ordered the massacre of all children in Palestine. And so the Holy Family escaped. And as they were doing so, one of Herod's soldiers nearly caught them as they were escaping. And he met a farmer, you can just see at the top there, sowing his field. And he says to the farmer, "Have you seen the fugitives? And when?" He said, "Yes, I have seen them when I was sowing my field." And he looked round, and miraculously, his entire field had grown up into fully grown corn. And so the soldier thought he was months too late and gave up pursuit. But that's how they escaped. The book of hours, the second part of the question, is the Hours of Jeanne de Navarre. This, again, is a subject of one of the chapters in the book. This is quite a small manuscript. It's about that big, made for the daughter of the King of France. Because she was a woman, she couldn't become couldn't become queen in her own right, but they made her Queen of Navarre, which is that little hilltop country between Spain and France. And this manuscript was illuminated for her around 1340. And it contains hours for the different hours of the day in honor of Saint Louis, Louis of France, who was her great-great-grandfather. And here is a picture in the manuscript of Saint Louis himself as a boy, learning to read from a manuscript. And the book he's learning to read from actually belonged to Jeanne de Navarre herself. It's a beautiful, beautiful little manuscript, made for a woman, and many of these early books of ours were made for women. And one of the things I particularly enjoyed about this book is following through the history of this manuscript, because it gets passed down through the women of the family. It goes to her daughter-in-law, and to her daughter-in-law's daughter-in-law, and then it goes to the Duke de Berry, who gives it to his niece, who was also called Joan, and who married Henry IV of England. So the manuscript came to London, and this added frontispiece was added to it. And then it went to her daughter-in-law, the wife of Henry V. And when she died with no children, they gave the manuscript to a convent in Paris, founded by the widow of St. Louis. So it was then used by women for the first few hundred years of its life, until the mid-17th century, when it was stolen from the, almost certainly stolen from the convent by a French antiquary, Nicolas de Peresque, sold eventually to a millionaire from the sugar plantations, and it passes through a succession of 19th century English owners until it was sold at Sotheby's in London in 1921, when it was bought by Edmund de Rothschild, the great baron and co-founder of the State of Israel, who died in 1935. And as you will know, in 1940, the Nazis occupied Paris, and the strong room of the Rothschilds was broken open, and the manuscript was stolen. And one of the little bits of work I was doing on writing this book is working through the archives in Paris about the losses during the war. And one of the great surprises, which no one knew, is that the Hours of Jeanne de Navarre was stolen to order by Hermann Goering. I show him here with Adolf Hitler. You didn't think this was going to come in a talk on medieval manuscripts. And it was sent for safekeeping to Berchtesgaden, right on the corner between Austria and Germany. And on the 2nd of May, 1945, the French and American armies entered Berchtesgaden, and the manuscript was found lying in the snow down by the railway station. And by a complicated series of negotiations, it is now finally back in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where it really belongs. But interestingly, it is the only one of the 12 manuscripts described in my book, which is now kept in the country where it was originally made, because manuscripts, as I learnt in New Zealand, are extremely portable.
So it started with a woman,
Sorry?
It started with a woman.
It started with a woman.
And then men, no? Men
and then men, yeah.
Yeah, always.
It's very interesting that women, I mean, of course, one of the great questions in the Middle Ages is when people in history learnt to read. And inevitably, men, monks particularly, were taught to read before nuns. And very often, women could read only in the vernacular. And so quite often, the first books written in the vernacular languages, French, German, Portuguese, English, are written for women, because the women hadn't learnt Latin. And the Hours of Jeanne de Navarre is written partly in French, because it's for the use of a woman.
Okay.
So women do come into it.
Yeah, good story. Well, Christopher and I, we talked about the story of the National Library in Rio de Janeiro. That is quite an adventurous story, because the National Library came 2 years after the moment when the Prince Dom João arrived in Brazil. And I think everybody knows that he had to leave Portugal because of the Napoleonic troops, and the National Library came in some boxes 2 years later. It's a very impressive one. It's a very adventurous story. And Christopher and I, we agreed to talk about a book of hours from the National Library. He wanted me to bring the book, and I explained that would be impossible. but at least we have some image to talk about. Now you have to put the images.
Can be done.
Yeah, that's ours.
I have to tell you, this is a shameful confession. I have never been to the National Library of Brazil. However, let me tell you that my son is getting married to a Brazilian girl on Saturday. So from the end of this week, I will have a Brazilian daughter-in-law, and I hope that I will be back here many more times. And of course, one of the places I must go.
Christopher is going to Belo Horizonte for a wedding. So.
Look at is this manuscript.
That's a very good reason, no?
Oh, well. Lily, however, has supplied me with 2 photographs of it, and this book, which was here in Brazil in the early 19th century, is, I would say, almost certainly the first illuminated manuscript known to have crossed the equator. The earliest manuscript in South Africa was there about 1820. The earliest one in Australia was there about 1830, but this was in Brazil by 1810. So I think that probably this is the first. This manuscript had traveled further than any other illuminated manuscript had ever done at the time it came here. It is a book of hours, the kind of thing we've been talking about. I haven't seen it. My guess is it's probably about that big. And it is entirely made by hand. And it was, to judge from the style, it was made in Paris. Paris was the biggest city in Europe. Very large numbers of books were being made there. This is the opening of Matins, the hour of Matins. I said there the text for the canonical hours of the day, matins, lauds, prime, terce, sex, nones, vespers, and compline. And this is the beginning of matins, when the Virgin Mary herself was, before dawn, in Nazareth, was reading a book, was reading the Psalms, when, according to tradition, when the angel Gabriel appeared to her and told her that she would conceive a son who would be the Saviour of the world. And to many women, this is a women's story, to many women in the Middle Ages, this was the most holy moment in the whole of history, that a perfectly ordinary woman like us suddenly found ultimate favour with God. And what was she doing at that moment? She just got out of bed. You can see her bed in the background there. She just got out of bed in the morning, and she's reading the Psalms. Therefore, a medieval woman using a book of hours, opening it up and reading those very same texts, was doing exactly the same as the Virgin Mary was at that moment. And women were encouraged to imagine themselves being that woman, being that person, using the book when Gabriel appears, as men were encouraged to imagine themselves at the crucifixion and watch or even experiencing the crucifixion, and that what it was like to suffer on the cross. And that is why pictures of the Annunciation and the crucifixion are the two most common images in medieval art, because they were used by men and by women. So the Book of Hours begins with a woman here, and then around the edge it has other scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary. So at the top is a birth scene. That's actually the Virgin Mary's birth. Further down is when she, as a child, was sent by her parents, Joachim and Anne, into the temple in Jerusalem. And at the bottom is her marriage or her betrothal to Joseph. And then the angel appears and says she'll have a son. And this is the only other image that I have from this manuscript. This is the evening office we saw before. This is Vespers. It shows, as the other one did, it shows the Holy Family journeying towards Egypt. You probably can't see because the picture's quite small, but behind the Virgin Mary's head is that same story of the soldiers catching up on the man who is sowing his field. And then on the right, you can probably just see on that pale green field is a statue on a pillar, a pagan statue, an ancient religious statue. And as the Holy Family walked past it as they went into Egypt, it falls off its pedestal. This is a medieval legend. And all visitors into Egypt in the Middle Ages were shown that statue lying in the sand. And we now know of it as the Sphinx. So what we call the Sphinx, they thought was that picture there falling off the pedestal. The style of the illumination here, as I said, was made in Paris. Paris had the biggest centre of the book trade in Northern Europe. The illuminators were not monks, they were professionals, and we know a great deal about them from the Paris tax records. We know most of their names, and we know where they lived. And the illuminators tended to be on the bridges crossing the Seine. And those of you who've been to Venice or Florence will know those covered bridges that go over the river, the Ponte Vecchio, in both cases. You had exactly the same in medieval Paris. And this is a miniature painted by Jean Fouquet. It's actually in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. But on the right, you can see the Petit Pont, the small bridge over the Seine with the covered walkways over it. And then on the left is Notre Dame, the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And in front of Notre Dame, there was a street running straight from the cathedral right down to the Royal Palace, where the Sainte-Chapelle is now. And that is where the medieval bookshops were situated. And here's a picture of me last year with a group of tourists outside Notre Dame, pointing out to them where all the individual bookshops were, where books of ours were originally bought in the 15th century. And there's a light coming, divine light coming down from heaven, confirming my identification. But this is exactly where the Book of Hours in Rio was first bought in 1460. That's where it comes from, exactly there.
Looks like a miracle, no?
Yeah, that's what it's meant to be. Of course it's a miracle.
That was purple, yes. So let us talk about business now.
Oh.
Manuscript can be a good deal. I mean, in the past, but also today. Can you talk about this kind of art markets and also the market of this illuminated manuscript, please?
I'm actually in a relatively unusual position among historians of medieval manuscripts in that I've spent a great deal of my life in the commercial world. I mean, I now work for a university, and I write what I hope are serious books. At least they're meant to be serious. But I have actually worked quite a lot in the art market. As I say, by chance, I joined Sotheby's in 1975, and I think many of my professors at university were rather horrified that I was sinking so low as to go into commerce. But I actually find it tremendously exciting. There is a thrill about the art market. Manuscripts were, of course, very often, mostly, made for individual people. They were privately owned. Books do survive. Books survive more than almost any other artifact. More books survive from the Middle Ages than anything else. People don't throw them away. They have no melt value. They don't destroy them. They keep them. And thousands, tens of thousands of books from the Middle Ages are still in private hands. And historians of manuscripts tend to forget this. They think they're all in the National Library of Brazil or other great public collections. There are, of course, many of them out there. And Sotheby's and Christie's both hold 2 sales a year of medieval manuscripts. And some are very expensive and some are very cheap. I have not really got an extensive series of pictures. We prepared these pictures before lunch. This is the grandest manuscript that came in for sale at Sotheby's in my time. This is the Gospel Book of Henry the Lion. It is a late second half of the 12th century Gospel book made for Henry the Lion, who was the Duke of Saxony and the founder of Munich. And it's about this big, and it's got 46 full-page paintings of the most extraordinary quality. This was brought into Sotheby's in 1983. And at that time, the most expensive old master painting ever sold.
How much?
Had made £2.2 million.
Wow.
This manuscript, which you see here it is being sold, made £8.2 million. So for about 5 years, the most expensive painting, work of art ever sold was not a picture, but a book. And I think in a literary festival you should remember that. There's another little interesting point. This is the binding of the manuscript. It was actually bound in Prague in the early 17th century. And on the front cover, you can see that little round thing. That is a rock crystal. And under the crystal is a relic of the finger bone of St. Mark, one of the 4 gospel writers. A rare opportunity of a book with part of one of the authors attached. And a selling strategy which should be adopted by the flip bookshop. Now the most expensive work of art ever sold is that Leonardo, which has gone to Abu Dhabi, sold last year for 500 million. I don't know whether any manuscript would be worth 500 million. The Book of Kells and the Très Richer are probably worth in the hundreds of millions. They are enormously valuable. But relatively small books. It's possible to own a medieval manuscript for $1,000. You can buy a fragment, a little piece of a medieval manuscript on eBay this evening for $30. They're not necessarily expensive. There are also dealers who sell them. A few minutes on Google will astonish you as to what is still available. And to me, I don't know. Not all people are the same. About a third of people are collectors by instinct. Those of you who are collectors will know exactly what I'm talking about. Those who aren't don't understand it. But that sort of sense that you could own a real medieval manuscript. And I stumbled on this when I was about 16, and on a brief visit to Europe with my brother when I was 16, I bought a half leaf from a medieval manuscript. And I bought it in Paris. It cost me 5 francs, about 50 pence. And I thought it was the most. I couldn't believe that an ordinary person could own one. And I still buy them. I still buy them from time to time. And any of you could. And I cannot sufficiently emphasize the difference of the experience of owning a manuscript as distinct from seeing it in a national library. You can go to any big collection, any big museum and look at it in a glass case. But that sense of taking it home and peering at it, and you look at it late at night, and you stare, and you notice things you've never noticed before. And there is a thrill in that, and it's not over. You can still buy medieval manuscripts. I don't know how much to say about that. We're going to have questions afterwards, and I will willingly take questions
we have some. We have some.
On the matter of the art market. I can tell you how it works or how auctions work, but I don't know how much you want. Is that enough for the moment?
We have some here. So, let me ask you one thing. Let me go back to your book. You told me a lot of histories about this book. Can you tell us about the history that you have inside the book? Or better saying, what's the sensation of finding documents in New York, in New Zealand, in Holland, in France? So this is the story of the book, no? Can you tell us one inside history of the book?
I showed you a picture of the Parker Library in Cambridge, and I encourage all of you to come and visit it next time you're in England, and I often say this to people, and I don't expect they're going to come. But one day, a literary agent turned up. She's called Caroline Dornay, turned up with no notice at Corpus and said, show me a manuscript, show me any manuscript. And in a rare moment of generosity, I got out for her the Bible of Bury St Edmunds. This is a giant manuscript about this big, painted about 1130, and it's the first work of art in England made by a known artist. And we spent about half an hour looking at it, and she asked questions, and I tried to answer. And at the end, we began to talk about whether it would be possible to write a book about the experience of looking at manuscripts. There are many books on illuminated manuscripts, but what we've tried to do in this one is to tell the story of what it is like to go to look at it, what it's like to visit the libraries. And when you really come to look at manuscripts at the top end, the really, really grand ones, and I really do mean the top end, like the Book of Kells shown here, just try and get them to take the Book of Kells out of its glass case so that you can look at it. It just won't happen. The really, really expensive and valuable books are not easily available. So the idea is, come with me, O reader, and we are going to see them. And I wrote to 12 libraries and said, I want to see such and such, some really, really expensive book. And of course they all said, ugh. And I said, but I'm going to write about it. And so I went round and I looked at all the manuscripts again, and you get this different experience of what the different libraries are like, what it's like to work in the library, in the Dunedin Public Library, or the British Library, or the Bodleian, or the Bibliothèque Nationale, or the National Library of Scotland, or the Vatican Library in Rome. So, and every medievalist knows what that's like. But to most people, these are inaccessible. So come along, and I will take you in, and we're going to sit down side by side, and we're going to look at books. And this is one of the French municipal libraries. There were wonderful manuscripts right across the provinces of France. At the time of the French Revolution, books were taken from the monasteries under Napoleon and just given to the local municipalities. And I spent a lot of time in the French libraries, and I love them. And you sit at these tables where children are doing their homework, and you're looking at 1,000-year-old manuscripts. It's just absolutely wonderful. Here's the library in Munich. This enormous staircase, it's very German. You feel about this big by the time you get to the top. Here's the library at Trinity College in Dublin, where the Book of Kells is kept. It was originally in glass cases right up the far end there. I think it's the most fantastic. The smell of libraries. If I ever had to market an aftershave, I would call it old libraries. There's a lovely, that smell of libraries and of collections. And this is me, again, it's the last picture of me I'm going to show you, in the National Library of Wales. And I am turning the pages of the so-called Henguert Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer was that great medieval English poet who wrote the Canterbury Tales, and this is his own manuscript, or as near to his own manuscript as we will ever have. And to me, that thrill of, it's like meeting a famous person, except it's 600 years later.
Yeah.
And here is actually turning the pages of a book which Geoffrey Chaucer himself handled. And I can't tell you what a thrill that is. It gives me enormous, enormous pleasure.
Allow me, Christopher. In your book, you wrote that it's not necessary to use gloves. And now I can, as far as I can see, you have gloves. Oh, what's your opinion about it? Well, in National Library, you have to use gloves, no?
The question of using gloves to look at medieval manuscripts is always a difficult and controversial one. I have to tell you, this is an unscripted question. If ever any of you have to appear on television looking at a manuscript, half the audience will write in outraged that you're not using gloves, and about half will write in outraged that you are using gloves. In the case of the Henguit Chaucer, when I arrived, I was introduced to the National Librarian, and they politely gave me gloves and took this photograph. The moment he'd gone, they said, "You can take the gloves off now." But to me, there's much more. Something much more tangible about using your fingers. One of the problems with gloves is that you have no real control with your fingers. Our fingers are made of animal skin, as the manuscripts are, and if you turn the pages of a manuscript carefully, I mean, clean hands matter, but turn the pages carefully, you've got much, much more control without gloves. Furthermore, if you're using pencil, and most libraries make you use pencil, and you're writing with gloves, the lead tends to come off on the end of the glove. I mean, of course it does, because it's rough. So as you turn the pages of the book, like that, black marks come on the manuscript. And most big libraries now do not make you wear gloves. So British Library doesn't, Bibliothèque Nationale doesn't, Vatican doesn't, Bodleian doesn't, Parker Library doesn't. And in my book, I describe how the Getty Museum made me put on gloves to look at the Spinola Book of Hours. And in a little throwaway paragraph, I said what a ridiculous nuisance this is, having to try and peer into a manuscript while wearing gloves. And I'm proud to tell you that because of that paragraph, you don't have to wear gloves in the Getty Museum now. I think that's,
So my suggestion is that after the wedding in Belo Horizonte, we could go to Rio de Janeiro for the National Library and ask them to allow us not to use gloves. Just joking.
I think we should have a second session, and we should invite you all to the National Library. We'll meet again in a week's time, and we'll get out the manuscript.
So I have some questions coming from the audience. The first one is, did you study the Torah?
Sorry, do I?
The Torah.
Oh.
What's the difference between the Torah and manuscripts regarding printing, letters, and so on?
The question is really about the Torah. The Torah, of course, is the Hebrew manuscript for the Pentateuch, what we in the West would call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It is the most sacred text of Judaism. And this is one of the, I don't describe any Hebrew manuscripts in my book, but it is one of the 2 great places where manuscripts are still made by hand. You can still get a Torah manuscript made in Israel now, and the methods they use and the writing of it and the making of the animal skin is exactly the same as it would have been in the Middle Ages. It is still a roll. They've not yet moved on to the invention of the book, of the codex form. So it's a roll like a classical text, written from end to end, and Torah scrolls are still being made. The other place where manuscripts are still made is Ethiopia, where you can still also get manuscripts commissioned, also made on parchment, also written by hand. But Torah scrolls are a survival, an extraordinary survival from a method of book production unchanged for 2,000 years. And the fact that it is unchanged is a really, really important part of the production. It's quite an interesting thing that of the three great religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, we all have sacred books. It is impossible to make a mistake when you're copying a Torah. If you do make a mistake of any kind, you can't scratch it out, you have to stop and start again. And the same applies if you're writing a Quran. A Quran, in theory, cannot have a mistake. They are very precious texts, and if it goes wrong, you have to abandon it and begin again. It is completely different in the Western tradition. We are much more pragmatic in Christianity. If you make a mistake in a Bible, you cross it out and write it in the margin. In fact, they often wrote the corrections in red because they wanted to draw attention to the fact that they'd corrected it. And corrected manuscripts are very characteristic of Western books, but not of but not of Torahs. That's one of the great differences between them. But I do find Hebrew manuscripts fascinating because many of them were made in Europe at the same time as Western books, sometimes illuminated by the same people. But they're in a kind of magic mirror world, back to front writing, alien, incomprehensible to most Christians in the Middle Ages, but they do exist. The Getty Museum have just bought an illuminated Torah. They bought a week ago. The price is undisclosed, but my guess is it would have been somewhere between $18 and $20 million. Certainly their most expensive book they've ever bought. And it is spectacular, so they do exist. Will that do?
Another question.
Yes.
Could you talk about the relation between Christian illustrated manuscripts and the ones seen in Islamic cultures?
The question is whether I could talk about the relationship between Christian and Islamic manuscripts. This is one of those questions that people have started writing books on or PhDs on 1,000 times, and the answer is nobody can find anything. There is no connection, as far as we know. First of all, a lot of our manuscripts look quite like Oriental books, particularly some of those, the ones done for the Duke de Berry, look very like Mughal art of the 17th century. But the Christians, the West, was doing them first. We were illustrating books long before there was any illustration in the Near or Middle East. There must have been some Oriental books in Europe in the Middle Ages. It stands to reason. Not a single one is known. We don't know of any that got to Europe. And I think the surprising thing is there is no known connection. And if there is a connection, it goes the other way around, and we were doing them first.
Oh, here's the difficult question. Are there many manuscripts that you love-handed that are in the hand of famous ancient or medieval authors in their autographs? Is that so? It's Pedro Corrêa do lado that asked it.
If I've understood the question correctly, and he will tell me if I'm wrong, what manuscripts survive in the autograph, in the actual handwriting of medieval authors? This, of course, is what we are all looking for, because if you're editing a medieval text, you want to get back as close as you can to what the author actually wrote. And every time you copy a book, people will make little mistakes. They may correct them. The next person who copies it may make other mistakes. He may correct things he thought were wrong, and so on. And the story gets more and more complicated as each generation goes on. And to get back to the actual handwriting of the author is tremendously important. And the answer is there are some. There are 12th century books in the handwriting of William of Malmesbury, great historian of Canterbury. Eadmer, monk, great historian of Malmesbury. Eadmer, monk of Canterbury, wrote a history of his own time, which survives in his own handwriting. The autograph manuscript of Boccaccio's Decameron is now in Berlin, so in the handwriting of Boccaccio himself, and pretty awful handwriting he had. Quite a number of manuscripts survive in the autograph of Thomas Aquinas, 13th century Dominican saint. He had terrible handwriting. He was left-handed, and people generally kept them not because they're interested in the text, but because he was a saint. So there are examples of of autographed manuscripts by him. Sometimes an author writing a book will very often write it maybe even on wax tablets or little bits of loose bits of paper. He'll give it to a professional scribe, like giving your thesis to a typist, and he'll then take it back and correct it. And we have quite a lot of manuscripts that are written by a professional scribe but corrected by the author. Christine de Pizan manuscripts, for example, survive like that. And I talk about the thrill of holding a manuscript that's belonged to a famous person. But there's also a thrill in holding a manuscript that was actually written by a famous person, and you can see the process of composition going on in their minds, words changed and alterations, and it's kind of utterly fascinating and doesn't exist now with word processors. Every one of the authors here now, probably every one of them, writes now on a machine, and there are no corrected autographs. It's over now, but there are of the Middle Ages, and it's fascinating. So yes, there are.
Could you please talk about? That's another question. Could you please talk about your favorite manuscripts? Have you got one? Now you have to talk about your kids.
The question
is,
could I talk about my favorite manuscript? I have to tell you that, unlike probably all of you, I have no taste at all. I like all manuscripts.
No, come on.
I've written a book about this particular book, I've done others, but this particular book, about 12 extremely grand and very famous manuscripts. But I could have been just as happy to write a book about 12 horrible manuscripts in dreadful condition. And each one, every book, every manuscript, unlike a printed book, every manuscript is different from every other one. They're handmade, hand thought out, hand copied, and rather like people, every single person is interesting. Everybody has a story. Every manuscript has a story, and they're all fascinating. I suppose if I had to choose, it's rather like when your children say, "What's your favorite color?" or something. I don't really know what my favorite. I suppose if I could choose one that really stands out, there is in Winchester Cathedral in England. There is a mid-12th century Bible, this big, in 4 volumes, illuminated for Henry of Blois, who was the brother of the king, and it has fantastic illuminated initials about this big, of the most astounding quality, and I've seen it quite a number of times, last time about 2 months ago. I think it is possibly the finest work of art ever made in England, and it was made in the cathedral, and it still belongs to the cathedral. It hasn't moved in 850 years, and I think it is one of the most moving and evocative objects surviving from the Middle Ages, and as I say, a candidate for the greatest work of art in England. I defy any of you to turn its pages and not be deeply moved by the spiritual and artistic quality of a book like that. The image I showed of gold put on, the drawing done with the gold put on around the edge of burnish, that was from the Winchester Bible. I think it's unfinished. Henry of Blois died in 1171 before it was finished and the money stopped. And so you get that moment when the creation was simply abandoned, and it's just magical manuscript.
And have you ever been in the library of Christian old monastery?
Have I ever been in a library of a monastery? I've been in a library of a number. I've been to quite a number of monasteries. Of course, in Europe, most of the monasteries were closed at different stages. In England, the monasteries were closed in the 1530s, mostly 1538 to 39. In Germany, many of them were closed in the 18th century, and many of the rest were closed under Napoleon, so the areas of Germany occupied by Napoleon were closed. In France, the monasteries get closed at the French Revolution, and the manuscripts go into public collections. However, there are still some places in the world where there are monasteries which still own manuscripts. I described a moment ago the Winchester Bible still belongs to Winchester Cathedral. It's not a monastery, but it's a functioning church. In Austria, there are many monasteries, Admont, Vorarlberg, Vettel, Melk, Klosterneuburg, and so on, which are still monasteries and still have manuscripts of the Middle Ages. I wrote a little piece once about medieval manuscripts in Croatia, where there are certainly monasteries, and in the cathedral in Zagreb, I was shown marvelous manuscripts taken around by a nun, and she said, you know, this is real gold. Look, she went across the manuscript. She said, look, it comes off, so you can tell it's real. And I'm sure it was like that with those descriptions of the antiquaries visiting monasteries in the past. But yes, there are still manuscripts belonging to monasteries. 1,000-year-old objects, not yet second-hand. We're talking about a long time ago, but it's a world that is not quite over yet.
Yeah. Christopher, we have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask you the last one.
Yes.
As a Sherlock Holmes of the manuscripts, can you say that you found everything you wanted to find?
The question is, it's a double question, really. Have we found every manuscript? And have we found out everything about every manuscript? The answer is absolutely not, and we never will. Thank goodness. Any of you who would like to devote your lives to manuscripts from now on, I can guarantee you will make discoveries. Every single student in the world working on medieval manuscripts identifies artists who've never been found before. They find manuscripts that have never been seen before. We are still finding and identifying manuscripts. We can still do it, and it will go on long beyond our lifetime. And I want to know everything about a medieval book. I want to know where it was made, and when, and why, and how, and what it's for, and who did it, and where, and what it cost, and how many pictures it had, and how they copied them, who they were, and what they were paid, and what they copied it from, and why it was done, and where it's been, and who read it, and how it survived, and how it's come from the Middle Ages, and what it's worth now, and how you get to see it now. And there is no limit to what I want to know.
So, Christopher, we wish you a pleasant time here in Paraty and a beautiful wedding in Belo Horizonte. Thank you very much for your generosity. If you want to have gold, please,
I leave you
please
go.
serve yourself here with gold. Thank you.